So today we'll be talking about Chapter 8, Section 3. And the title of this is Women and Reform. And this could have been one of your group subjects that you chose. We're going to be talking about the early women's rights movement in American history today, including suffrage, which is the right to vote. But we'll also be talking about slavery, as well as women's expected roles in the family. And so as we talk about the women's rights movement, it has been a movement towards greater equality by gender dating back to the earliest parts of our country. And so we'll start by talking about the family. In early American history, there was a culture of domesticity. And that's what I mean by cult there. Culture of domesticity. Domesticity, the root word of that is domestic, meaning home. And it was the idea, the culture, the way of life, that a woman's expected role in life was to care for her family at home. And that housework and child care should be the primary roles of a woman throughout her life. In fact, your book references a marriage manual from the early 1800s. And it says that the only chemistry a woman needs to know is how to boil water. The only geography a woman needs to know is how to get around her house. Can you imagine how limiting that would be? Now, this is not a written law that women have to be stay-at-home mothers, that women had to care for their families. But it was a cultural expectation that this was to be the norm for a woman's life. Of course, not all women married, though most did. Some women could find work in the factories. Lowell, Massachusetts was a textile factory. It was the first of its kind in the United States. Hired primarily women. Because by hiring women, they could pay women half as much as they would have to pay a man. And there was no law against that. For the exact same job, they could pay a woman half what they could pay men. Women had very few legal rights. They were not allowed to vote. They could not sit on juries. They did not even have legal guardianship of their own children. So this idea of a nation of the people, by the people, for the people was rather hypocritical, if you think about it. Our founding fathers, keyword there, fathers, because we're talking about a patriarchal system, rebelled against the British government because they were being taxed without representation. And yet, aren't we doing the same to women here? In fact, a married woman's property belonged legally to her husband, as well as guardianship of the children. What a woman earned belonged to her husband. If her husband passed away, the cultural norm was for the husband's nearest male relative to care for the widow and her children. And if there was an unmarried male relative, that person would make that family his own. And that was the norm. That was the idea. That was the expectation. And it was all based on the religion and culture of the time. There are many passages in religious text central to American culture. I'm being careful with my words there. That say a woman must be submissive to her husband. It says that over and over again in various religious texts, not just one religion, but many that were prevalent at that time. And so this idea of domesticity. Did you know it was considered inappropriate for a woman to address a man in public? We're not talking about Sharia law. We're talking about Christian fundamentalism. Did you know it was considered inappropriate for a woman to speak in public? In fact, that was considered sinful. 1 Corinthians 11:7, a woman is to remain silent in the churches. If she has a question, let her ask her husband at home. Do you know it was considered inappropriate for a woman to hold positions of authority over men? And how much misogyny have we heard about this recent presidential election? Again, how many comments in reference to gender have we heard about presidential candidates? Now, we're going to be talking about the women's rights movement. And I hope some of you chose this for your group stuff. And I'm excited to hear some of your topical projects on the same subject. You see, there are quite a few women who didn't agree with this standard of living, who challenged this way of life. There's a woman worth knowing about. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott formed the first American Women's Rights Society. And so we'll be talking about some of the achievements of these women. Now, this is a caricature, meaning a cartoon, a political cartoon, a work of satire, meaning they're poking fun at what these women are trying to accomplish. You see here George Washington. Seated at his right hand is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. At his left, Susan B. Anthony. And in this heavenly throne. You see a lot of images like this of Washington in D.C., in fact. And we'll see some of these when you go on tour of D.C. But this one here, talking about the Women's Suffrage Association. Suffrage means the right to vote. And we'll come back to the right to vote in just a moment. But first, abolition. Yesterday we were talking about the movement to end slavery, known as abolition. Many women were a part of this movement as well. For example, Sarah and Angelina Grimke were two daughters of a southern slave owner who, despite being raised on the idea that slavery was a biblically ordained institution, when they became adults, they grew up and realized that slavery was wrong, even though everything they had ever been taught was contrary to that idea. They just knew deep down in their hearts that slavery was wrong. And they became a part of the abolition movement, even though their father was a slave owner. Can you imagine how much courage that would have taken for these two girls to stand up to their father and say, "Your way of life is evil"? I don't know if I have those kind of guts to stand up and say, "Mom, Dad, what you are doing is wrong, and I'm going to work to stop you." Can you imagine? That's what these young girls did. They did that at a time when it was considered inappropriate for a woman to even speak in public. And they decided to challenge their own father and commit their lives to working against what he did for a living. Some men supported women reformers. Others denounced them, calling them all kinds of nasty names, because women would have been seen as acting very inappropriately to try to publicly protest anything. Because, again, the idea of womanhood at this time was an idea of submissiveness. And here these women were challenging the status quo. Many women became involved in the temperance movement. Temperance was the movement to outlaw the drinking of alcohol. In fact, it was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which eventually became successful in the passage of the 18th Amendment, which made prohibition constitutional law. But I want you to think about why women would be so involved in the temperance movement. It wasn't unheard of for women to drink at this time, but it was less common. Generally, liquor was considered a man's drink at that time. And it wasn't uncommon for men to come home drunk. And it wasn't unheard of for drunk men to beat their families. Yet, it was considered unheard of, unlawful for women to divorce their husbands. Women had no legal grounds for leaving their families at this time. And so, what can women do? Legally, they had very little power. And so they began to work to outlaw one of the causes of their misery, and that was alcohol. And the American Temperance Society was founded in 1826. Because you see, as this engraving from 1840 shows, a family driven to despair by alcohol, poverty and misery, depravity, with the drunken deadbeat dad. That's all too familiar in today's culture. But notice a couple other things. Women were expected to wear bonnets. Does anybody know why women were expected to wear bonnets? They had to have a head covering. You mean women had to have their head covered? Their full body from neck to foot covered?
People thought that they were being provocative.
Yes, exactly. Now, what culture do we talk bad about when they cover themselves today? So, again, Sarah and Angelina Grimke. By this time, they were older. But you still see them wearing this traditional garb, very kind of puritanical clothing. Only the face could be seen. But they spent their life and career working for the abolition of slavery. Educational opportunities for women in the 1800s were very rare. Now, a wealthy woman from a wealthy family could gain access to private tutors and gain entry to some universities. But there were rarely opportunities for the common woman past elementary school. In fact, there were very few elementary schools in the United States until after the American Civil War. However, some of the very first women's colleges opened up in the early 1800s. For example, Emma Willard opened Troy Female Seminary in 1821. Mary Lyon founded Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, both for studying religious studies. Yet, colleges were strictly segregated by gender. The very first coeducational college was Oberlin College. At first only admitted 4 women. In fact, though there's not as much press about it, the movement to desegregate by gender was just as slow and controversial as the movement to desegregate by race. And of course, African American girls had very, very few opportunities to get a good education. Women's health was also deplorable. The very first clinic for women was opened up by a woman named Elizabeth Blackwell. Would be a fascinating woman to study for one of your projects. You see, understanding of women's health was very primitive at this time. It was believed that the woman was responsible for the gender of the child, which in fact it's the male. It was generally assumed it was the woman's fault if infertility was an issue. And infertility was an acceptable grounds for divorcing of a wife, even though there was no proof that it was the man or the woman. Generally, women, like men as well, lived very unhealthy lives. Nutrition was rather poor. Living conditions, especially in cities, were rather unsanitary. And a national survey of women's health, the first of its kind conducted by Catherine Beecher, found that most women were unhealthy. But even the clothing of the time was very prohibitive for a woman to be comfortable or to be active. For example, Angelina Bloomer was extremely controversial and became legendary for designing a style of clothing that allowed women to ride a horse. She made pants. Did you know it was considered uncouth for a woman to wear pants? Of course, they had to wear these long dresses that covered up everything, even the ankles. But she designed bloomers. I'm going to show them to you. This is what earned Angelina Bloomer a bad name. But the ladies' bloomers could split down the middle, allowing a woman to ride a horse in a traditional way. Of course, they were covered around the middle. They were essentially large pants.
Parachute pants.
Yeah, big pants, big poofy things with many, many layers. Because without these, a woman would have to ride a horse side saddle. And you can never ride a horse side saddle at faster than a walk. To canter a horse side saddle would be very dangerous. And so women were limited in their mobility because of their dress. In fact, women were limited in their activity because of their dress as well. You don't have to do this, but just for fun, put your hands on your ribs, press in. Now, take a deep breath. What do you notice?
Hard.
Yeah, it's hard. What are we simulating? Can you say it? A corset. Very good. So what a corset does is it creates an hourglass figure. We're not all shaped like an hourglass, but that was considered the ideal shape at that time. And so women would put corsets on to constrict their torso to give them the hourglass shape. Not unlike the practice of Chinese foot binding. Anybody familiar with the practice of Chinese foot binding? The quote, the standard of beauty at that time was that a woman's foot would resemble the shape of a lotus, a flower. And so to make that happen, they would bind a young girl's feet from a very young age so that as they grew, they would form into the shape of a flower. Now this prevented them from being able to walk very far. It's why you see walking like this sometimes in anime. Because of the tradition, it dates back to the tradition of Chinese foot binding, so that women would have to walk almost tiptoed, because it's the only way they could move. We weren't as extreme as binding feet, but the corset hinders a person's breath to the point that women would faint. That's why you hear in old stories of a woman growing faint, or you look pale. Well, sure, she looks pale. She's not getting any blood to her head because this thing's cutting her off. Anyway. Now, the women's rights movement first gained national attention at the Seneca Falls Convention for Women's Rights in 1848. The movement was somewhat about economic opportunity, providing more opportunities for women to work outside the home, but it was also about equality. The idea of recognizing the need for equality by gender. And one of the great accomplishments of this convention was a declaration of sentiments. It was modeled after the Declaration of Independence. It was based on the idea that equality for all, or that created equal in the sight of God, as the Declaration states, doesn't mean just all men are created equal. In fact, one of the agreements of this convention was that men and women were created equally. And that, though controversial, and though it was debated heavily in this convention, women should have the right to participate in public issues. Because isn't that fundamental? Isn't that from the First Amendment, that we have the right to meet in public peacefully, that we have the right to seek redress of grievances publicly and peacefully, that we have the right to speak out publicly what is on our mind? And yet women were being withheld these very same rights that are stated in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And of course, suffrage, the right to vote for women. Again, even in this convention, it was hotly contested. It was very controversial. The vote to pass suffrage as a goal of the women's rights movement was very narrowly passed. And so in 1848, the movement to gain the right to vote for women was begun. Does anybody know when that movement would finally be successful at a national level? 1920, when the 19th Amendment would be passed. Guys, 72 years. It took 72 years from the Seneca Falls Convention, when it was agreed upon that suffrage would be a goal, until finally it was achieved. Can you imagine what these women must have faced in working towards this goal? Can you imagine the type of hostility that women would have faced by daring to suggest they had the same rights as men? Can you imagine the types of crude comments these women must have had to endure? The types of attacks on their reputation that these women must have had to endure. And regardless of your politics, have you noticed the types of comments that a female candidate for president has had to endure? Again, put your politics aside. Just think of the types of comments about a woman's gender that this person has had to endure. Whether you agree with her or not, she's had guts to face those types of comments. One of my favorite ladies in American history is a former slave named Sojourner Truth. She traveled the country preaching about not only women's rights, but about the movement to end slavery. She's a hero to many. One of the gutsiest ladies I've ever seen or read about. I think I heard one of the groups talking from her famous speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" Who's doing that one? Anybody? Yeah. Current global injustices against women. Currently, women have gained the right to vote in all countries except for Saudi Arabia and the Vatican City. These are the only countries that currently allow men, yet not women, the right to vote. Now, I want to be careful to point out not all countries allow the right to vote for any citizens, but these are the only ones currently that allow women, but men but not women. In Yemen, a country near Saudi Arabia, women are not permitted to leave the house without permission from their husbands. Globally, women still do not have equality. Pay inequity is still a problem, even in our country. But yet, if it weren't for the social advocacy of brave women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, how would our country be different? If women were not willing to stand up for their rights, would things be any different today? Because we went as a society for thousands of years treating women far differently than we treated men. And yet today it is considered inappropriate to do so publicly. Yet, subtly, we still treat women differently than we do men, though it's inappropriate today to do so publicly. And yet, if women do not stand up, if they continue to tolerate misogyny, which means a bias towards men, it will continue to remain the same.